Most political thinkers start from a theory and then apply it to the world around them. Hannah Arendt worked in the opposite direction, starting from catastrophe and thinking backward. She watched the rise of totalitarian regimes that no existing category of political thought could explain. Tyranny did not cover it. Dictatorship did not cover it. What she saw was something genuinely new, a form of government designed to make human beings superfluous. That experience forced her to rethink politics from the ground up, not as a branch of philosophy, but as a distinct human activity with its own logic. She asked what we do when we act together, what kind of world that acting creates, and what destroys it. Arendt resists classification. She is not a liberal, not a conservative, not a socialist, not a communitarian. She belongs most naturally to the tradition of civic republicanism running from Aristotle through Montesquieu and Jefferson, but even that label captures only part of the picture. Her work spans totalitarianism, revolution, the nature of evil, the structure of thought, and the problem of judgment. Each of these subjects connects to the others, not as a system, but as a network of responses to a single question. That question is how people can share a common world and remain free within it. What follows is a reconstruction of her complete philosophy, not as biography, but as argument. Each part isolates a distinct idea, builds the problem it addresses, and follows the reasoning to its conclusion. Where her arguments face strong objections, those objections appear at full strength. Where questions remain open, they stay open. Part 1. Totalitarianism as a new form of government. Before Arendt, political theory had a standard vocabulary for bad governments. There were tyrannies, where one person rules by fear for personal advantage. There were despotisms, where power concentrates in a single, unaccountable authority. There were dictatorships, where emergency powers harden into permanent rule. Every one of these forms was terrible, but they were all intelligible. They served the interests of the rulers, punished opposition, and maintained some predictable order. What Arendt encountered in National Socialism and Stalinism did not fit any of these categories. These regimes did not simply oppress their populations or crush dissent in order to stay in power. They pursued policies that were self-destructive even by the standards of ordinary ruthlessness. The Nazi extermination camps consumed resources desperately needed for the war effort. Stalin's purges liquidated his own most competent administrators and military officers. The regimes were not even rational tyrannies acting in their own self-interest. This is the observation that forced Arendt's analysis. If these regimes were not serving any intelligible end, what were they actually doing? Her answer was that they aimed at something no previous government had attempted. They sought to transform human nature itself by eliminating spontaneity and individuality. The concentration camps, in her analysis, were laboratories for this project. They existed not primarily for punishment, forced labor, or even murder as an end in itself. They existed to demonstrate that everything is possible, that human beings can be reduced to mere bundles of predictable reactions. How did this become possible? Arendt traced a set of historical elements that crystallized into totalitarianism without causing it. She deliberately avoided causal explanation because she thought causation implied inevitability. Instead, she identified conditions that, when combined in a specific historical moment, made this new form of government possible. 3 elements mattered most. First, modern anti-Semitism, which differed from older religious hatred of Jews in being secular and political. Second, imperialism, which exported violence to colonial territories and created populations trained in racial domination. Third, the collapse of the European nation-state system, which produced masses of stateless and rootless people with no political home. The crucial concept here is the mass. Arendt distinguished the mass from the mob and from organized classes of society. The mob consisted of those cast out from all social classes, people with particular resentments and particular interests. The mass was different. It consisted of people who had lost all social connection, all stable group membership, all sense of common interest. These were not angry people with a cause, but isolated people with no cause at all. They had lost the capacity to distinguish between fact and fiction, between what was real and what was fabricated. Totalitarian movements recruited from these masses through propaganda that did not try to persuade. Instead, it offered a total explanation of the world, an ideology that claimed to reveal hidden laws behind all events. For the Nazis, the hidden law was nature, understood as a racial struggle for survival. For the Stalinists, the hidden law was history, understood as an inevitable march of class conflict. Once the ideology was accepted, everything followed from its internal logic with apparent necessity. No fact could refute it, because facts themselves could always be reinterpreted as further evidence. The organizational structure of totalitarian regimes reflected this drive toward total domination. Rather than building a stable hierarchy, these regimes deliberately maintained overlapping and competing institutions. Responsibilities were duplicated, chains of command were blurred, and no official could ever feel secure in his position. This was not administrative failure, but deliberate design. The chaos prevented anyone from developing independent judgment or building a stable power base. Above this deliberately shapeless structure sat the secret police, the only institution with real clarity of purpose. Arendt argued that totalitarianism carried a self-destructive logic. Because it aimed at total domination rather than any stable political order, it could not stop expanding. It could not consolidate, could not reach equilibrium, could not become a functioning government in any ordinary sense. Its essence was movement, and without continued expansion and radicalization, it would collapse. It bore, as she put it, the germ of its own destruction. The argument has drawn serious criticism. Some historians argue that Arendt overstated the parallels between Nazism and Stalinism by treating them as instances of a single phenomenon. The two regimes had different social bases, different ideological content, and different relationships to their own populations. Others point out that her analysis of the camps, while philosophically powerful, was based on limited empirical evidence available in the early 1950s. More recently, scholars like Bettina Stangneth have challenged her later portrait of Eichmann by showing that he was more ideologically committed than he appeared at trial. These criticisms have force, but they do not reach the core of her contribution. What Arendt provided was not primarily a historical explanation, but a new political category. She identified a form of government whose essential feature was the drive to make human beings superfluous. That category remains a working tool for political judgment, a yardstick for measuring whether current events serve totalitarian ends or not. Part 2. Loneliness, Isolation and Solitude. Tucked into the final pages of The Origins of Totalitarianism is a distinction that bears on everything Arendt later wrote. She separated three conditions that are easily confused: isolation, loneliness, and solitude. Understanding these three terms is essential because each one describes a different relationship to the world and to other people. And totalitarianism, Arendt argued, depends on a specific one of them. Start with the most familiar. Isolation is the condition of a person cut off from the political realm, unable to act together with others. A craftsman working alone in a workshop is isolated in this sense. He has no access to the public space where collective decisions are made. But he is not necessarily lonely because he still stands in relation to the world through his work. His products enter the common world, are used by others, and connect him to a shared human reality. Isolation destroys the capacity for political action, but it leaves the capacity for productive work intact. Loneliness is more devastating. A lonely person has lost not just the company of others in political action, but the sense of belonging to any shared world at all. Loneliness is the experience of not being confirmed by anyone, of having no place where one's existence matters. You can be lonely in a crowd precisely because the crowd provides no real human connection. A person stuck in traffic, surrounded by thousands of others, may feel more existentially abandoned than a hermit who has deliberately chosen withdrawal. Here is the crucial move. Arendt argued that loneliness, unlike isolation, destroys not just political capacity, but the capacity for thought itself. Thinking, in her account, requires an inner dialogue, a conversation between me and myself. This internal conversation depends on a prior experience of being with others in a meaningful way. A person who has never been genuinely heard by another has no internalized partner for this silent dialogue. Loneliness hollows out the inner life as thoroughly as it empties the outer one. Solitude is the third term, and it looks like loneliness from the outside, but works entirely differently. In solitude, a person is alone, but not lonely, because she remains in the company of herself. Solitude is the condition in which thinking happens, the voluntary withdrawal from the world that allows the inner conversation to unfold. The person in solitude can return to the world of others refreshed rather than diminished by the experience of being alone. Why does this matter politically? Because totalitarianism specifically requires loneliness, not just isolation, as its psychological foundation. A person who is merely isolated can still think independently and resist propaganda through private judgment. A lonely person cannot, because loneliness has destroyed the very capacity for independent thought. The totalitarian subject is someone so cut off from shared reality that the regime's fictional world becomes the only world available. Ideology rushes in to fill the void left by the collapse of genuine human connection. This analysis makes a prediction that carries into the present. Any society that produces mass loneliness is generating the preconditions for totalitarian movements, whether it intends to or not. The loneliness need not come from political repression. It can come from economic displacement, the erosion of community institutions, or technologies that simulate connection while preventing genuine encounter. When large numbers of people lose their footing in a shared world, they become available for ideological capture. They will accept almost any total explanation that offers the feeling of belonging, however fictitious that belonging actually is. Part 3. The Pariah and the Parvenu. Before Arendt turned to general political philosophy, she was thinking about a specific political condition, the situation of European Jews in the modern world. This was not mere autobiography, though it grew from her own experience of exile. It was a philosophical analysis of what happens when a group is included in society but excluded from politics. She built this analysis around a distinction borrowed from the historian Bernard Lazare, the Pariah and the Parvenu. These two terms describe two strategies available to any outsider group facing a hostile majority. The Parvenu is the outsider who gains entry to society by giving up her distinctiveness. She assimilates, adopts the manners and assumptions of the majority, and purchases social acceptance at the cost of authentic selfhood. The pariah is the outsider who refuses this bargain, who remains outside respectable society and retains her independence. The Parvenu strategy, Arendt argued, was the dominant response of wealthy and assimilated Jews in 18th and 19th century Europe. They gained entry to salons and cultural life by becoming exceptions, by being the kind of Jew that Gentile society found acceptable. But this acceptance was always conditional and always personal. It extended to the individual, never to Jews as a group. The Parvenu had to constantly perform her acceptability, and the moment she stopped performing, it could be revoked. This arrangement created a specific psychological and political trap. The Parvenu could never acknowledge that her problem was political, that it required collective action rather than individual charm. To admit that anti-Semitism was a political structure rather than a personal misunderstanding would destroy the premise of her social position. So the Parvenu became invested in seeing every instance of hatred as an aberration rather than a pattern. The pariah had a different kind of insight precisely because she had no investment in the existing arrangement. Standing outside respectable society, she could see its structures more clearly than those inside it. Arendt traced a tradition of what she called conscious pariahs, figures like Heinrich Heine, Bernard Lazare, Charlie Chaplin, and Franz Kafka. These were people who turned their outsider status into a vantage point for seeing political reality without illusion. The argument has a cutting edge that extends far beyond the Jewish experience. Arendt was describing a dynamic that operates wherever a marginal group faces pressure to assimilate on terms set by the majority. The choice between Parvenu and pariah recurs in every situation where belonging is offered at the price of self-erasure. And the deeper political point is that the Parvenu strategy always fails in the end. When the political crisis arrives, when the majority needs a scapegoat, the assimilated outsider discovers that her acceptance was never real. It was always a social courtesy that could be withdrawn by political decision. This early work already contains the seed of one of Arendt's most persistent themes. Political problems require political solutions, and the attempt to solve political problems through private individual strategies is a form of self-deception. The pariah who becomes conscious, who recognizes that her exclusion is political, is the one who can act. The Parvenu, who insists that the problem is personal, has already surrendered the only ground on which resistance is possible. Part 4. The right to have rights. After the First World War, millions of people in Europe became stateless. The treaties that redrew national borders created minority populations who belonged nowhere. Denaturalization laws stripped citizenship from entire groups, and those who lost their nationality lost everything that came with it. They could not legally work, travel, or reside anywhere. They existed in a legal void, present on the earth but absent from every political order. The obvious response was to invoke human rights. The great declarations of the 18th century had proclaimed that every person possesses rights simply by virtue of being human. These rights were supposed to be inalienable, meaning they could not be taken away by any government because they preceded government. They belonged to human beings as such, not to citizens of any particular state. Arendt pointed out that this doctrine collapsed at precisely the moment it was most needed. When stateless people appeared who had no government to protect them, their supposedly inalienable rights evaporated entirely. No country felt obligated to take them in. No institution could enforce their rights on their behalf. The rights that were supposed to be independent of political membership turned out to depend entirely on it. This was not a failure of enforcement, but a failure of the concept itself. The doctrine of natural rights assumes that rights belong to the human being as such, prior to any political arrangement. But Arendt argued that a right you cannot exercise, because no political community recognizes you, is not actually a right. It is an abstraction that does nothing for the person who holds it. The stateless person had all the theoretical rights in the world and could exercise none of them. From this she derived her most famous formulation about rights. The fundamental right, the one on which all other rights depend, is the right to have rights. That means the right to belong to some political community that recognizes you as a member. Without this prior belonging, every other right, speech, property, worship, assembly becomes purely theoretical. The right to have rights is not itself listed in any declaration, but it is the condition without which all listed rights are empty. The argument cuts in two directions simultaneously. It is a critique of the nation-state system, which made rights dependent on nationality and thereby left the stateless with nothing. But it is also a critique of the philosophical tradition that grounded rights in human nature rather than in political institutions. If rights come from nature, then no political failure can explain their absence. If rights come from political membership, then their absence is a political catastrophe that demands a political remedy. Arendt did not offer a neat solution to this problem, and the absence of one is philosophically important. She called for what she described as a new law on earth, a political structure that would guarantee membership itself as a basic human entitlement. But she never specified the institutional form this would take, and scholars still debate what she intended. Salah Ben Habib has argued that something like it exists in embryonic form in international human rights regimes. Others, like Eitan Gundogdu, insist that the right to have rights remains fundamentally unresolved, a demand that no existing institution adequately answers. The tension remains alive today. Millions of people worldwide are stateless, and millions more are refugees whose formal nationality provides no actual protection. Every time a person is denied asylum and left in a legal void, Arendt's question reasserts itself. Are human rights real if no political community is willing to enforce them for this particular human being? Part 5. Thinking without a Bannister. Arendt inherited a specific problem from the catastrophe of totalitarianism that shaped her method for everything that came after. The political and moral tradition of the West had failed to prevent, predict, or even adequately describe what happened in the 20th century. The categories of political philosophy, refined over 2,000 years from Plato onward, simply did not contain the concept of totalitarianism. They had no place for a regime that sought not power for its own sake, but the elimination of human spontaneity as such. This meant that the tradition was broken, not merely outdated, but genuinely ruptured. You could not go back to Aristotle or Montesquieu and find a ready-made framework for understanding what had happened. Arendt compared the situation to standing in a gap between past and future. The past could no longer be transmitted as a continuous heritage, and the future could not be predicted from any established pattern. Her response to this rupture was not to abandon the tradition, but to scavenge it. She adopted a method drawn from two sources that she combined in an original way. From Walter Benjamin, she took the idea of a fragmentary approach to history that recovers disconnected moments of insight rather than continuous narratives. From Martin Heidegger, she took the practice of going back to original experiences that had become buried under layers of inherited interpretation. The method works like this. Instead of accepting a concept as the tradition hands it to us, you ask what original experience gave rise to that concept in the first place. Take the concept of authority. The tradition treats authority as though its meaning were obvious, but Arendt asks what the Romans actually experienced when they first gave the concept political form. By returning to that originating moment, you can separate what was genuinely discovered from what was later distorted or forgotten. She described this approach as thinking without a banister. A banister is a railing you hold onto as you climb stairs, something that keeps you from falling. The Western tradition of political thought had served as such a railing for centuries. You could hold on to its categories, its hierarchies, its assumptions about human nature and feel stable. After totalitarianism, that railing was gone, and you had to think with nothing to hold on to but the activity of thinking itself. This is not a celebration of rootlessness or a postmodern embrace of fragmentation. Arendt was not saying that the past has nothing to teach us. She was saying that its teachings can no longer reach us through the unbroken chain of tradition. Instead, we must retrieve specific fragments, specific insights, specific moments of clarity from the wreckage and make them speak to our present situation. The past becomes a quarry rather than a temple, a source of usable material rather than an object of reverence. This method explains why Arendt constantly returns to ancient Greece and Rome throughout her work. She is not being nostalgic or proposing that we recreate the Athenian polis. She is going back to the original experiences of political life, the first articulations of what it means to act together as free equals in order to recover something that the tradition itself obscured. The Greeks are useful precisely because they precede the philosophical tradition that later distorted their discoveries. Part 6. The Disappearance of Authority. There is a concept that most people think they understand until they try to define it precisely. Authority is not force, because force compels the body while authority commands the will. Authority is not persuasion, because persuasion works through argument between equals, while authority depends on an acknowledged inequality. Authority is not power, because power arises from collective action, while authority can reside in a single person or office. Arendt argued that authority in the political sense is a specifically Roman invention. The Greeks had no equivalent concept in their political vocabulary. Roman authority, called auctoritas, was rooted in the founding of the city. The Roman Senate possessed authority not because it held power, but because it was linked to the original act of foundation. Its members were the elders who preserved the spirit of that founding moment and could advise the living generation in its light. Authority in this sense was always backward-looking, always deriving its force from a past event that remained binding on the present. This Roman concept was later absorbed into the Catholic Church, which substituted the founding of Rome with the life and death of Jesus as the foundational event. The Church became the institution that carried authority in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Political authority, religious authority, and the authority of tradition formed a kind of trinity that held together the Western world. When one element weakened, the others compensated. Arendt's claim is that in the modern age all three have collapsed, and this collapse is irreversible. Authority, tradition, and religion no longer structure the common world or provide shared standards for judgment. This is not primarily a religious crisis or a crisis of values. It is a political crisis because without authority there is no recognized source of legitimacy that stands above the contest of competing interests. Consider what fills the void when authority disappears. If there is no acknowledged source of legitimacy beyond power itself, then every political question reduces to a question of who is stronger. The left tends to see the loss of authority as an opportunity for liberation from oppressive structures. The right tends to see it as a catastrophe requiring restoration of traditional hierarchies. Arendt thought both responses missed the point. Authority cannot be restored once lost because it depends on an unbroken connection to a founding moment, and that connection has been severed. But the loss of authority is not simply liberation either, because without it, the public realm loses the stability that makes sustained action possible. This argument contains a warning that applies directly to contemporary politics. When people no longer recognize any authority beyond their own preferences and the power to enforce them, politics degenerates into a contest of wills. The result is not freedom, but a constant oscillation between anarchy and authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, in Arendt's precise usage, is the attempt to substitute violence for authority, to create by force the obedience that authority once commanded naturally. The more authority disappears, the more tempting this substitution becomes. And the substitution always fails because violence can compel behaviour but never generate the willing recognition that genuine authority requires. Part 7. Labour and the Life Process. The Human Condition, published in 1958, opens with a distinction that looks simple and turns out to restructure everything we think about work and politics. Arendt divided the active life into 3 fundamental activities: labour, work, and action. These are not 3 types of employment or 3 sectors of the economy. They are 3 fundamentally different ways that human beings engage with the world, each governed by its own logic, each producing different things, each requiring different human capacities. Start with labour, which Arendt defines as the activity tied to biological necessity. Labour is everything we do to keep ourselves alive: growing food, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the body. Its products are consumed almost as soon as they are produced. You eat a meal and the meal is gone. You clean a house and it needs cleaning again tomorrow. Labour follows the rhythm of the body, the endless cycle of need and satisfaction that we share with every other living creature. There is a specific character to labour that Arendt wanted to isolate. Labour produces nothing permanent, nothing that outlasts the process of consumption itself. The effort expended in labour leaves no trace in the world. It sustains life, but life itself is not a thing that can be pointed to as the product of labour. This is why labour feels repetitive and often meaningless despite being absolutely necessary. Its necessity does not give it significance because significance requires some enduring result, some mark left on the shared world. Arendt used a Latin term for the being defined by labour, the animal laborans, the labouring animal. This is not an insult, but a precise description of what labour shares with animal life. Every living organism labours in the sense of working to sustain its own biological existence. What distinguishes human labour from animal metabolism is only that humans have made this process enormously more productive through tools and social organisation. But the fundamental character remains the same: cyclical, consuming, leaving nothing behind. Here is where the argument begins to bite. Arendt claimed that modern economies have elevated labour to the highest position in the hierarchy of human activities. We measure the health of a society by its productivity, its consumption, its gross domestic product. We define ourselves by our jobs, which are mostly forms of labour rather than work in Arendt's sense. We treat the endless cycle of production and consumption as though it were the point of being alive. This is what she meant by the victory of the animal laborans. The critique is uncomfortable because it challenges something most people take for granted. We assume that economic growth and material abundance are self-evidently good, the proper goals of any political community. Arendt did not deny that people need to eat and that starvation is terrible. Her point was different. When an entire civilization organizes itself around the values of labour, around productivity and consumption as ultimate purposes, it loses the capacity to do anything except sustain and reproduce itself. It becomes a society devoted entirely to the maintenance of life, with nothing to show for that life once it ends. Part 8. Work and the durability of the world. If labour sustains biological life, Work builds the durable world that human beings share. Arendt's term for the being defined by work is homo faber, the fabricating human. The carpenter who makes a table, the architect who designs a building, the artist who creates a painting, these are all engaged in work rather than labour. Their products are not consumed but used, and they outlast the activity that produced them. The distinction turns on durability. A loaf of bread is a product of labour because it is consumed and disappears within hours. A table is a product of work because it stands in the world for decades, providing a stable surface around which people can gather. The world, in Arendt's specific sense, is precisely this collection of durable objects and institutions that stands between people and provides them with a shared reality. Without this world of things, human beings would have nothing in common except their biological nature. They would live and die like animals, leaving no trace of their passage. Work operates according to a means and ends logic. The carpenter begins with a mental image of the table, selects materials, and applies techniques to realize the design. The process has a definite beginning and a definite end. When the table is complete, the work is finished. This is entirely different from labour, which has no end point, because biological needs are never finally satisfied. Work produces a finished thing that can stand on its own in the world, independent of the process that created it. Homo faber relates to the world through instrumentality, through the mastery of means in service of ends. This gives the fabricator a kind of sovereignty over his material that the labourer never has over the life process. The labourer is subject to nature's rhythms. The fabricator imposes his design on nature, bending raw material to a predetermined form. This sovereignty is the source of the fabricator's confidence and also the source of a specific danger that Arendt wanted to identify. The danger is this. When the means and ends logic of fabrication is applied beyond its proper domain, everything becomes an instrument for something else. If you ask what the table is for, you can say it is for eating dinner. If you ask what dinner is for, you can say it is for sustaining health. If you ask what health is for, you can say it is for continued productivity. The chain of means and ends never reaches a point where something is valued for its own sake. Applied to politics, this logic turns citizens into instruments of the state and the state into an instrument of history. Every human being becomes a means to some further end, and the idea that persons are ends in themselves is lost. Arendt admired what Homo faber creates, the durable world of objects, buildings, institutions, and artworks that gives human life stability and permanence. But she insisted that the mentality of fabrication, the habit of treating everything as raw material for a project, is fatal when it enters the political realm. Politics is not a craft with a blueprint. When leaders treat it as one, they treat people as material to be shaped rather than agents to be heard. Part 9. Action, Speech, and the Revelation of Who You Are. Action is the third and highest activity in Arendt's hierarchy of the active life. It corresponds not to the needs of the body or the requirements of building a world, but to the human condition of plurality. Plurality is Arendt's term for the basic fact that many different human beings, not a single human being, inhabit the earth. Every person is unique, irreplaceable, and capable of doing something that has never been done before. Labour reveals nothing distinctive about the person performing it. Everyone labours in basically the same way because biological needs are universal. Work reveals talent and skill, but even the most beautiful table tells you what the maker could do, not who the maker was as a distinct person. Only action, which Arendt always links inseparably to speech, reveals the identity of the agent. Think about what it actually means to reveal who you are. You can describe your qualities: tall, educated, impatient, good at mathematics. But all of these are what qualities, characteristics that other people also possess to varying degrees. Who you are is something different, something that shows itself only in the way you act and speak among others. It appears in the stories that others can tell about you, in the specific, unrepeatable way you responded to a particular situation. You cannot exhibit your who the way you display a skill, because your identity is not a possession you control. It reveals itself to others, often without your full knowledge or intention. Here is the concrete force of the argument. A person enters a political meeting and speaks about a proposed policy. What she says may be intelligent or foolish, but in saying it she also reveals something beyond the content of her words. Her manner of engagement, the risks she is willing to take, the way she responds to disagreement, all of this discloses her as a particular person distinct from every other. This disclosure is not something she planned or designed. It happens because action takes place in the presence of others who witness it from their own perspectives. Action is therefore inseparable from plurality in a way that neither labour nor work is. You can labour alone on a desert island, and you can build a shelter with no audience. But you cannot act in isolation, because action is by definition something that occurs in the space between people. Without others to see and hear and respond, there is no web of relationships for action to enter and no audience to register who you are. This is why Arendt links action so tightly to speech. Words are the primary medium through which we insert ourselves into the human world and make ourselves intelligible to others. Action without speech would be mere physical behaviour, observable but uninterpretable. Speech without action would be empty declaration, words disconnected from any real engagement in the world. Together they constitute the specifically human way of being present among other human beings. There is an important consequence that follows from all this. The meaning of an action is never fully available to the person performing it. Because your action enters a web of relationships involving other actors with their own intentions and perspectives, its consequences are never under your control. The meaning of what you did becomes visible only after the fact, told as a story by others who witnessed it. Arendt argued that action depends on narrators and storytellers who can retrospectively give it coherent form. Without the storyteller, the deed would vanish as surely as the products of labour are consumed. Part 10. Natality and Plurality. Two concepts anchor Arendt's entire political philosophy, and both are deceptively simple to state. Natality is the fact that every human being is born, and thereby introduces something genuinely new into the world. Plurality is the fact that many unique beings, not one generic humanity, share the earth together. Start with natality, because it is the more unusual philosophical move. The Western philosophical tradition has overwhelmingly oriented itself around mortality, around the fact that we die. From Plato's claim that philosophy is a preparation for death through Heidegger's analysis of being toward death, finitude has been the master concept. Arendt reversed this emphasis completely. For her, the central fact of human existence is not that we die, but that we are born. The reversal is not sentimental. It has precise philosophical content. Every birth is the arrival of someone who has never existed before and will never exist again. This means that every newborn carries the capacity to begin something unprecedented, to start a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Action, in Arendt's sense, the ability to initiate something genuinely new, is rooted directly in this fact of birth. We can act because we are beginners, because the capacity for beginning is written into our very existence as beings who once began. This is also why Arendt was drawn to revolutions as her primary examples of political action. A revolution is the most dramatic form of beginning, the attempt to found something entirely new in the political world. But Natality operates on much smaller scales as well. Every time a person speaks up in a meeting when silence was expected, every time someone refuses a role that has been assigned to them, the capacity for beginning is at work. Natality is not reserved for heroes. It is the ordinary miracle built into the structure of every human life. Plurality, the second concept, describes the condition that makes action meaningful. If all human beings were identical, there would be no need for speech, because everyone would already know what everyone else thinks. If all human beings were entirely different, with no common nature at all, communication would be impossible. Plurality names the fact that we are equal enough to understand each other and distinct enough to need to. These two features of plurality, equality and distinction together create the need for politics. Because we are distinct, we inevitably see the world from different perspectives and disagree about what should be done. Because we are equal, we can talk to each other about those disagreements rather than simply fighting. Politics, in Arendt's vision, exists in the space opened up by this specific combination of sameness and difference. There is a direct implication for how we think about political regimes. Any regime that suppresses plurality, that demands uniformity of thought, or eliminates the space for genuine disagreement, is destroying the very condition that makes politics possible. Totalitarianism was the most extreme form of this destruction, but subtler versions exist wherever conformity replaces genuine encounter between different perspectives. A society of perfect consensus would not be a political achievement, but a political catastrophe, because it would mean that plurality had been extinguished. Part 11. The Space of Appearance. Where does politics happen? The usual answers point to institutions: parliaments, courts, bureaucracies, electoral systems. Arendt gave a more fundamental answer that reframes the question entirely. Politics happens wherever people appear to each other through speech and action. She called this the space of appearance. It is not a physical location, though it requires some kind of setting where people can gather. It is the space that comes into existence between people whenever they act and speak together in a way that discloses who they are. A town hall meeting creates a space of appearance. So does a protest, a constitutional convention, a neighbourhood assembly, or any gathering where people deliberate about their common concerns. The critical feature of this space is its fragility. Unlike a building or an institution, it does not survive the departure of the people who created it. The space of appearance exists only as long as people are actually engaging in collective speech and action. The moment they stop, the space vanishes. It has no material substrate that would preserve it in the absence of the activity that generated it. This means that the space of appearance must be constantly recreated through ongoing political engagement. Think about what this implies for democratic life. Democracy is not secured once and for all by writing a constitution or establishing the right institutions. Institutions are necessary, but they are materializations of a power that originates somewhere else, in the actual coming together of citizens. When citizens stop appearing to each other, stop debating and deliberating and acting in concert, the institutions that were supposed to embody their power become empty shells. They continue to exist as administrative structures, but the living political reality has drained out of them. Arendt found historical examples of the space of appearance erupting spontaneously in moments of crisis. The revolutionary clubs of Paris in 1789, the workers' councils that appeared during the Russian Revolution, the Hungarian Revolt of 1956, all of these were cases where ordinary people created public spaces for political action outside existing institutions. These moments fascinated her because they showed that the capacity for political life is never completely extinguished. Even under conditions of total repression, people retain the ability to come together and begin something new. But the fragility cuts both ways. These spontaneous eruptions of political freedom almost always failed to establish durable institutions. The councils were absorbed by parties, the revolutionary spaces were captured by professional revolutionaries, and the energy of collective action was channeled into bureaucratic administration. This pattern, the brilliance and brevity of the space of appearance, is one of the central tensions in Arendt's political thought. How do you preserve the living reality of political action without killing it through institutionalization? She returned to this question throughout her career and never fully resolved it. Part 12. Power against violence. Nearly every major political thinker in the Western tradition has treated power and violence as belonging to the same continuum. Power is the ability to get what you want, and violence is the most extreme means of doing so. From Max Weber's definition of the state as the monopoly on legitimate violence to Mao Zedong's declaration that power grows out of the barrel of a gun, the equation seems obvious. Arendt argued that this equation is not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. Her argument proceeds by defining 5 terms that are routinely conflated: power, strength, force, authority, and violence. Each designates a genuinely different phenomenon, and confusing them produces political disasters. Power corresponds to the human ability to act in concert. It is never the property of an individual, but always belongs to a group that has come together for a common purpose. When we say someone is in power, we mean that a group has empowered that person to act in their name. The moment the group withdraws its support, the power disappears, regardless of how many weapons the leader controls. Strength is the property of an individual, a personal quality that belongs to a single person or object. Force, in Arendt's usage, should be reserved for the energy released by physical or social movements, the forces of nature or historical circumstance. Authority, as discussed earlier, is the unquestioned recognition of legitimacy that requires neither coercion nor persuasion. Violence is purely instrumental, depending on implements and tools that multiply the natural strength of the user. The crucial distinction is between power and violence. They are not only different, but in an important sense, they are opposites. Power needs numbers. The more people who act together, the more power they generate. Violence can manage without numbers because weapons allow a single person to coerce many. The extreme form of power is all against one. The extreme form of violence is one against all. This means that violence is not a greater degree of power, but a substitute for it. Governments resort to violence precisely when their power is slipping away, when the consent of the governed can no longer be maintained. A regime that rules entirely by violence, with no residual power derived from the support of any portion of the population, is in fact the weakest possible political arrangement. It depends entirely on its instruments of coercion and collapses the moment those instruments fail. The practical consequence of this distinction is counterintuitive and important. Violence can always destroy power, but it can never create it. You can use violence to demolish an existing political order, to scatter a community, to break a movement. What you cannot do is use violence to generate the willing cooperation of free people that constitutes genuine political power. Every attempt to do so produces obedience without consent, compliance without commitment, order without legitimacy. The strongest objection to Arendt's position comes from thinkers like Frantz Fanon and from the broader tradition that sees liberating violence as politically creative. Fanon argued that colonial violence could only be answered by counter-violence, and that this counter-violence had a constitutive political effect on the colonized. More recently, scholars like Chad Kautzer have argued that Arendt's sharp separation of power from violence implicitly leaves state violence unexamined, while focusing criticism on the violence of resistance movements. The Foucauldian tradition questions whether power can really be understood without reference to the material structures, including violent ones, through which it operates. Arendt did not deny that violence can sometimes be justified in the short term. She accepted that it may be a rational response to intolerable injustice. What she denied is that violence is ever legitimate in the way that power is, because legitimacy requires the ongoing consent of a political community, and violence by definition bypasses consent. The danger she identified is not that violence is always wrong, but that confusing it with power makes us blind to what politics actually requires. Part 13. Promising and Forgiving. Action, for all its dignity, carries two built-in defects that no amount of skill or good intention can eliminate. The first is unpredictability. Because action enters a web of relationships involving other actors, no one can control or foresee where it will end. The second is irreversibility. What has been done cannot be undone, and the consequences of action once launched may persist forever. These are not occasional hazards that careful planning can avoid. They are structural features of action as such, consequences of human freedom and plurality. Because every actor is free, And because many free actors inhabit the same web of relationships, every action triggers reactions, counter-reactions, and cascading consequences that no one intended or anticipated. You set something in motion, and you cannot take it back, and you cannot know where it will go. The Western philosophical tradition offered one major response to this problem: stop acting. Plato elevated contemplation above action precisely because the philosopher in thought suffers neither the unpredictability nor the irreversibility of political engagement. The Stoics counselled withdrawal from worldly affairs for the same reason. Christianity devalued the active life in favour of the contemplative life, and the monastic ideal was explicitly a rejection of action's hazards. In each case, the solution to the dangers of acting was to retreat from the sphere of human affairs entirely. Arendt refused this solution because it amounts to abandoning the one activity that makes us distinctly human. Instead, she found two remedies that arise from within action itself, not from outside it. These remedies are the faculty of forgiving and the faculty of making promises. Forgiving addresses irreversibility. When someone does something whose consequences cannot be undone, forgiveness offers a way to release both the doer and the one affected from being trapped forever by a single act. Without forgiveness, every misdeed would bind its participants to that deed for the rest of their lives. The past would become an inescapable prison, and the capacity to begin something new would be destroyed by the accumulated weight of everything that has already happened. Arendt traced the discovery of forgiveness as a political faculty to Jesus of Nazareth. This is a philosophical claim, not a theological one. She argued that Jesus was the first to recognize that forgiveness has a role in the public realm, not merely in the private relationship between the individual and God. Forgiveness between people, enacted in the space of human affairs, is what makes continued action possible despite the irreversibility of everything we do. Promising addresses unpredictability. In a world where nobody can foresee the consequences of action, the capacity to make and keep promises creates small islands of reliability in the ocean of uncertainty. A promise binds the one who makes it to a specific course of future action, and thereby introduces a measure of predictability into a realm that would otherwise be completely chaotic. Treaties, contracts, constitutions, and covenants are all forms of promising that attempt to stabilize the political world. Both faculties depend on plurality. No one can forgive herself because forgiveness requires the acknowledgement of another person. No one is bound by a promise made only to herself because a promise without a witness imposes no real obligation. This means that the very remedies for action's defects are themselves forms of action, requiring the presence and participation of others. There is a limit to each remedy, and Arendt was honest about it. Forgiveness cannot handle what she called radical evil, deeds so monstrous that they exceed the human capacity to forgive. Promising cannot eliminate unpredictability entirely because promises can always be broken, and because the future always exceeds what any set of promises can bind. These remedies are partial, fragile, and dependent on the ongoing willingness of people to exercise them. They do not solve the problem of action so much as make it bearable enough to continue acting. And that, for Arendt, was the most that could honestly be hoped for. Part 14. The Rise of the Social. In the ancient Greek world, life was divided into two sharply separated domains. The household, or oikos, was the realm of necessity, where people laboured to meet biological needs, manage property, and raise children. The polis was the realm of freedom, where citizens who had already secured their material survival could appear before equals and engage in speech and action. These two spheres had different governing principles and different standards of excellence. Arendt argued that modernity destroyed this distinction through a process she called the rise of the social. The social is a hybrid realm that is neither truly private nor truly public. It occurs when activities that were once confined to the household, production, consumption, the maintenance of biological life, expand outward and come to dominate the public sphere. When a society's primary collective concern becomes the management of its economy, the social has triumphed over the political. Consider the language we use to evaluate governments. We judge them by unemployment figures, gross domestic product, inflation rates, standards of living. These are all measures of how well a society manages the collective life process of its members. They are the concerns of a giant household, what Arendt called a national housekeeping operation, applied at the scale of an entire nation. The political question, how should we live together as free beings, has been replaced by the administrative question, how do we efficiently manage our collective survival and comfort? The rise of the social produces conformity as a structural byproduct. In the household, the authority of the head of the family ensured order through command. In the political realm, order emerged from the contest of diverse opinions among equals. The social realm produces order through a different mechanism, the statistical norm. When society becomes the primary framework for human life, behaviour replaces action. People are expected to conform to patterns, to fill roles, to behave in statistically predictable ways. Anyone who deviates is not a political opponent to be argued with, but an anomaly to be corrected. This analysis has drawn more criticism than perhaps any other part of Arendt's work. The objections are serious and come from multiple directions. First, Habermas argued that Arendt's revival of the Greek distinction between household and polis is hopelessly anachronistic. Modern politics cannot exclude economic questions because economic structures are themselves structures of power and domination. To insist that poverty and exploitation are pre-political is to leave the most consequential forms of unfreedom unexamined. Second, feminist critics, including Benabib and Pitkin, pointed out that Arendt's idealization of the public sphere depends on the exclusions that made the Greek polis possible. The leisure for political activity was purchased by the labour of women and slaves in the household. By treating the household as a realm of mere necessity, Arendt renders invisible the people who made public freedom possible for others. The feminist insistence that the personal is political is precisely a refusal to accept the boundary Arendt wants to maintain. Third, her own concept of the social has been called incoherent. She identifies it sometimes with biological necessity, sometimes with modern capitalism, sometimes with mass culture and conformity. These are not the same thing, and conflating them produces an analysis that is evocative but analytically blurred. These criticisms have genuine force, and Arendt never adequately answered them. Yet the core insight survives the objections. When a society can only talk about politics in the language of economics, something has been lost. The question is whether that loss is an inevitable feature of modern complexity, as Habermas suggests, or a genuine impoverishment that might be partially reversed. That question remains open. Part 15. World Alienation and the Archimedean Point. The final chapter of The Human Condition shifts from political theory to a diagnosis of modernity that connects science, philosophy, and the fate of the common world. Arendt identified two forms of alienation that define the modern condition: world alienation and earth alienation. They are distinct phenomena with a shared consequence: the progressive destruction of the stable shared world that makes politics possible. World alienation began with a specific historical process: the expropriation of peasant property during the Reformation and the rise of capitalism. When church lands were seized and redistributed, and when enclosure acts drove people off common lands, millions lost their fixed place in the world. Property for Arendt is not primarily wealth, but a location, a piece of the world that belongs to you and from which you cannot be expelled. When people lose their place, they lose their worldly footing, their stable point of contact with a shared reality. The result is masses of property-less labourers whose only connection to the world is through the consumption of its products. Earth alienation is a more radical phenomenon and begins with the scientific revolution. When Galileo turned his telescope toward the sky, he did something philosophically momentous beyond confirming a heliocentric model. He demonstrated that the human senses are unreliable guides to the nature of reality. What the eyes see, a sun moving across the sky, is not what is actually happening. Truth must be accessed through instruments that extend beyond the body and through mathematics that has no natural counterpart in human experience. Arendt used the metaphor of the Archimedean point to describe what science achieves. Archimedes said he could move the earth if he had a place to stand outside it. Modern science found that place not physically but cognitively by adopting a standpoint from which the earth is viewed as if from outside. The telescope was the first instrument that achieved this, and space exploration would later literalize the metaphor. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, Arendt saw it as the physical enactment of a desire that had been building for centuries, the wish to escape the conditions of earthly existence. The consequence of finding the Archimedean point is that human experience is demoted as a source of knowledge. If the senses deceive, then the world as it appears to us, the world of colours, sounds, textures, and shared perceptions, has no epistemic authority. Only mathematical formulas and experimental results count as genuine knowledge. But the world of appearances is the only world we share as political beings. It is the world in which we speak, act, and encounter each other as distinct persons. The scientific revolution thus undermined the common world from a direction that no political theory had anticipated. From this alienated standpoint, Cartesian doubt becomes the default philosophical posture. If the senses lie, then you cannot trust the world to be as it appears, and the only certainty left is the activity of your own mind. Descartes retreated to the cogito, the certainty of the thinking self as the one unshakable foundation. But this retreat into the self is simultaneously a retreat from the shared world. Philosophy, after Descartes, increasingly became concerned with the contents of consciousness rather than with the reality of the common world. Arendt was not anti-science, but she recognized a specific danger in the scientific worldview when it becomes the only worldview. A civilization that trusts only what can be measured, tested, and expressed in mathematical language has already abandoned the world of human affairs. Political judgment, moral reasoning, aesthetic experience, and the encounter with other persons all depend on the validity of appearances, on the shared world as it shows itself to human beings. If that world is dismissed as mere subjective illusion, then the foundations of political life are destroyed, not by violence, but by epistemology. Part 16. Revolution and the Social Question. On Revolution, published in 1963, compares the American and French revolutions to draw out a distinction that reshapes how we think about political freedom. Both revolutions began with the same goal, the foundation of a new political order based on freedom. Both attracted leaders who were steeped in classical republican thought and who saw themselves as founders of new institutions. But the two revolutions diverged radically, and Arendt's analysis of why they diverged contains one of her most controversial arguments. The French Revolution was overwhelmed by what she called the social question, the problem of mass poverty. When the revolutionaries opened the political stage, the poor flooded in with demands that could not be answered through deliberation or constitutional design. Hunger is not a political problem in the sense that it can be debated and decided. It is a biological emergency that demands immediate relief. The presence of mass poverty transformed the revolution from a project of political founding into a project of social liberation. Freedom was redefined as freedom from want rather than freedom to participate in public life. This redefinition, Arendt argued, was fatal. Once the revolution became about solving the social question, it required unlimited power to achieve unlimited ends. The leaders who promised to end poverty needed to override every constitutional constraint that stood in their way. Terror followed not from the personal corruption of the revolutionary leaders, but from the logic of their task. You cannot liberate a starving population through debate. You can only do it through force, expropriation, and the suspension of all legal restraints. The American Revolution succeeded in Arendt's analysis precisely because it did not face this problem. The colonists were, by European standards, relatively prosperous and had already experienced a degree of self-government. They were not driven by desperation, but by a positive desire to constitute a space for political freedom. Their revolution was about forms of government, about how to institutionalize the experience of collective self-rule that they had already tasted in town meetings and colonial assemblies. This argument has been attacked from several directions. The most damaging objection is that the American Revolution's freedom from the social question was purchased by slavery. The relative prosperity of the colonists depended on the labor of enslaved people, a fact that Arendt acknowledged but did not fully integrate into her analysis. If the freedom to engage in politics requires that someone else do your laboring for you, then the distinction between political freedom and social liberation is not as clean as Arendt suggested. A further objection comes from those who argue that you cannot separate the political from the economic so neatly. If a constitution protects property rights in a society of radical inequality, then the founding itself has already decided the social question just in favor of the wealthy. The American founders' ability to focus on political design was not a triumph of political wisdom over social passion. It was a reflection of their social position, a position made possible by forms of domination they chose not to address. Arendt knew about slavery's role and called it the hidden social question of the American Republic. She considered it a moral catastrophe that would haunt the nation permanently. But she maintained that the distinction between founding freedom and solving poverty is philosophically valid, even if the American case is historically compromised. A revolution that aims to eliminate misery can succeed in that goal and still leave its people with no political freedom whatsoever. That was her point, and it stands regardless of the imperfections of her chosen example. Part 17. Founding and the Abyss of Freedom. Every revolution that seeks to create a new political order faces a problem that Arendt thought was truly unsolvable in theory. The problem is this: where does the authority of a new beginning come from? A constitution derives its authority from the act of founding. But the act of founding cannot itself derive authority from the constitution it creates, because the constitution does not yet exist. The founders cannot appeal to tradition, because they are precisely breaking with tradition. They cannot appeal to God unless they are establishing a theocracy, which the American founders explicitly were not. They cannot appeal to natural law unless they are prepared to submit their political creation to a standard that precedes and transcends it. But if the whole point is that political freedom is constituted by human action rather than grounded in nature, then natural law cannot serve as a foundation either. This is what Arendt called the abyss of freedom. The founding act is genuinely unprecedented, a moment of pure beginning that cannot be authorized by anything that came before it. The founders are legislating from nowhere, creating something out of nothing in the political sense, and they cannot point to any prior source of legitimacy for what they are doing. The Romans solved this problem by wrapping the founding of Rome in legend, linking it to divine ancestry and to the fall of Troy. The foundation was made sacred by connecting it to a mythical past that placed it beyond question. The American founders tried a different approach. They appealed simultaneously to self-evident truths and to the act of mutual promising. The Declaration of Independence declares truths to be self-evident, while the Constitution enacts a mutual compact among the people. These two strategies are in tension with each other, one pointing to truths that exist before politics, the other creating authority through the political act of agreeing together. Arendt was drawn to the promising model because it kept authority grounded in human action, rather than in nature or God. The authority of the Constitution on this reading derives from the mutual commitment of citizens who pledge to be bound by it. This is a form of the power of promising extended to the scale of an entire political community. The founding is the greatest act of collective promising in political life, the moment when a people constitutes itself as a people by binding itself to a shared framework of laws. But the abyss never fully closes. Every founding carries an element of arbitrariness that no theory can eliminate. The moment of beginning is free in the most radical sense. It is not determined by what came before, and it cannot be fully justified by any principle external to itself. This is why successful foundings tend to become sacred over time, surrounded by rituals of reverence that conceal the raw contingency of their origin. The alternative to sacralization is the permanent awareness that our political institutions rest on an act of human will that could have gone otherwise. Whether that awareness is liberating or terrifying depends on how much freedom a people can bear. Part 18. The Council System. Throughout her work on revolution, Arendt noticed a recurring historical pattern that most political theorists had ignored or dismissed. In every major revolution, from the French Revolution to the Paris Commune to the Russian Revolution to the Hungarian Uprising of 1956, something appeared spontaneously and without planning: councils. These were not party organizations or trade unions or interest groups. They were self-organized bodies of citizens who came together to govern their own affairs through direct deliberation. In France, they were called communes or sociétés populaires. In Russia, they were Soviets. In Hungary, they appeared as workers' councils and neighborhood councils. In every case, ordinary people who had no previous political training created institutions for collective self-government from nothing. The councils fascinated Arendt because they were the living embodiment of everything her theory of action described. They were spaces of appearance created by people acting in concert. They generated power in her precise sense, the capacity that arises when free people deliberate together. They allowed individuals to appear as who they are through speech and action on matters of common concern. And they arose spontaneously, proving that the human capacity for political life is never fully extinguished, even under conditions of severe repression. She proposed the council system as a genuine alternative to representative democracy. Her model was a pyramidal federation of councils starting at the local level. Neighborhood councils would send delegates to city councils to regional councils, and so on upward to a national body. Delegates at each level would be chosen not by party affiliation, but on the basis of demonstrated judgment and commitment to public affairs. This was not representation in the ordinary sense, because delegates would carry the trust of their peers rather than the votes of anonymous constituents. Arendt was frank about the elitist implication of this proposal. The council system would produce a self-selecting political elite, but one chosen by the criterion of caring about public affairs rather than wealth, birth, or party loyalty. Those who chose not to participate would effectively exclude themselves from political life. Arendt accepted this consequence and argued that it was preferable to a system in which political parties reduce citizens to passive voters who choose between pre-packaged options they had no hand in creating. Critics have treated this proposal as utopian, a romantic fantasy disconnected from the realities of modern governance. Margaret Canavan called it a curiously unrealistic commitment. The historical record supports the skeptics. Every time councils have appeared, they have been crushed by parties, co-opted by ideologues, or dissolved by their own organizational weakness. James Muldoon and others have pushed back, arguing that the council idea is not a naive hope, but the logical institutional consequence of Arendt's entire political philosophy. If freedom requires direct participation and the space of appearance must be constantly recreated, then some form of the council system is the only structure that could sustain what Arendt meant by politics. The question is not whether it is realistic, but whether anything else actually satisfies the conditions her philosophy identifies. Part 19. Civil Disobedience. In the 1960s and early 70s, the United States faced a crisis of legitimacy that forced a question most democracies prefer to avoid. What do citizens owe a government whose laws they consider profoundly unjust? The civil rights movement and the anti-war movement confronted this question practically, and Arendt addressed it philosophically in her essay on civil disobedience. She began by separating civil disobedience from two things it is commonly confused with. It is not conscientious objection, which is the individual's private refusal to obey a law that violates personal moral convictions. The conscientious objector acts alone and appeals to an inner voice that may or may not be shared by anyone else. Civil disobedience, by contrast, is a collective act performed in public by a group of citizens who appeal to a shared principle. Nor is civil disobedience revolution. The revolutionary seeks to overthrow the entire legal order and replace it with a new one. The civil disobedient accepts the general framework of the legal order and violates specific laws in order to force attention to their injustice. The disobedient remains within the political community, even while contesting particular features of it. Arendt grounded civil disobedience in her theory of promising and consent. A constitutional republic derives its legitimacy from the ongoing consent of its citizens, and that consent is a form of tacit mutual promising. But consent is meaningful only if it can be withdrawn when the government violates the terms of the original compact. Civil disobedience is the withdrawal of consent made visible and public, the citizen's way of saying that the government has broken the promise on which its authority rests. This framing has a crucial consequence. Civil disobedience is not a moral act performed by exceptional individuals, but a political act rooted in the structure of constitutional government itself. It belongs to the logic of democratic legitimacy rather than to the private conscience of the individual citizen. Arendt argued that the American legal system should recognize civil disobedience as a legitimate form of political engagement, not something to be merely tolerated or punished lightly. The voluntary associations that practice it are performing a function essential to the health of the Republic. They are testing the limits of consent and forcing the community to re-examine its commitments. The danger she identified was not civil disobedience itself, but the refusal to distinguish it from criminal law-breaking on the one hand and from revolutionary violence on the other. When governments treat civil disobedience as ordinary criminals, they deny the political character of the act, and thereby deny the citizens' standing as members of the political community. When disobedience themselves escalate into violence, they abandon the ground on which their claim to legitimacy rests. The power of civil disobedience lies precisely in its publicity, its non-violence, and its appeal to principles the community already claims to hold. Part 20. The Banality of Evil. In 1961, Arendt travelled to Jerusalem to attend the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer who organised the deportation of Jews to extermination camps across occupied Europe. She went because she wanted to see for herself what a person who had committed radical evil actually looked like. What she encountered in the courtroom did not match any of her expectations. She expected a monster, a fanatic, or at least someone with a discernible ideology strong enough to motivate mass murder. What she observed was a man who spoke almost entirely in clichés and stock phrases. Eichmann could not produce a single original sentence. When pressed about his motives, he spoke of career advancement, obedience to orders, and the importance of doing his duty. He showed no deep hatred of Jews and no particular ideological commitment. His primary concern at the trial seemed to be presenting himself as a law-abiding citizen who had done what was expected of him. This observation gave rise to the phrase for which Arendt is most famous and most misunderstood: the banality of evil. The phrase does not mean that the Holocaust was trivial or that its horrors were ordinary. It does not mean that Eichmann was merely following orders, a defense Arendt explicitly rejected. She noted that he zealously pursued the extermination program and sometimes disobeyed direct orders in order to accelerate it. She supported his death sentence without reservation. What the phrase describes is the character of the doer, not the nature of the deed. Eichmann's evil was banal because it did not spring from demonic conviction, deep-seated hatred, or any intelligible motive proportionate to the horror of its results. It sprang from an inability to think, by which Arendt meant something precise: the inability to examine a situation from any perspective other than one's own immediate self-interest and the expectations of one's immediate environment. Eichmann had no inner dialogue, no habit of stepping back from the flow of events to ask whether what he was doing was right. This was a significant departure from her earlier position. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, she had described totalitarian evil as radical, using Kant's term, meaning evil that goes to the root of the human condition by seeking to make human beings superfluous. After the trial, she concluded that evil is never radical in the sense of having depth. It has no demonic dimension. It spreads on the surface like a fungus, covering everything precisely because it has no root to hold it in place. Only the good, she wrote, has depth that can be radical. The criticism was immediate and fierce. Many accused her of exonerating Eichmann or trivializing the crimes of the Nazi regime. Her comments about the role of Jewish councils, some of whose leaders had cooperated with deportation orders, generated outrage in Jewish communities worldwide. More substantively, scholars like Bettina Stangneth later argued that Eichmann was more ideologically committed than he appeared at trial, that his performance of banality was itself a calculated strategy. The Stangneth critique is the strongest, but it does not fully undermine Arendt's point. Even if Eichmann was more anti-Semitic than he let on, the phenomenon Arendt identified, that monstrous evil can proceed from shallow motives and unthinking conformity, remains a genuine and terrifying possibility. The question she asked was not whether Eichmann in particular was a thoughtless bureaucrat. The question was whether the absence of thinking is itself a sufficient condition for the worst kinds of evil. That question has only grown more urgent with time. Part 21. The Two in One. The trial of Eichmann forced Arendt to investigate the activity of thinking itself, an activity she had previously set aside in favour of the active life. The question was direct. Could the habit of thinking, the simple practice of conducting an inner dialogue with yourself, make a person less likely to participate in evil? To answer this, she went back to Socrates, whom she considered the purest example of a thinker in the Western tradition. Socrates did not produce a philosophical system or write a single word. What he did was think in public, by which Arendt meant he asked questions that dissolved received opinions and forced his interlocutors to examine what they thought they knew. After these conversations, people were left with fewer certainties than they started with, and Socrates himself claimed to know nothing. But Socrates also said something about thinking that Arendt treated as philosophically foundational. He said that it is better to be at odds with the whole world than to be at odds with yourself, since you are one. Arendt took this to mean that consciousness reveals a fundamental duality within the self. When I think, I am not simply alone. I am engaged in a silent conversation between me and myself, as though two partners were speaking within one person. She called this structure the two-in-one. The two-in-one is not metaphorical for Arendt. It describes the actual structure of conscious experience when a person reflects, rather than merely reacts. In the middle of daily life, this duality is invisible because you are absorbed in activity and oriented toward the external world. It becomes apparent only in moments of solitude, when the world's demands recede and you are left in the company of yourself. Here is the moral consequence. If thinking is a dialogue between me and myself, then I have to be able to live with my partner in that dialogue. I cannot escape myself the way I can walk away from someone I disagree with. If I do something that my internal partner would find intolerable, I will be at war with myself, and that internal conflict is a form of suffering no external pleasure can compensate for. Thinking, in this sense, produces conscience not as a set of rules, but as a byproduct of the ongoing need to remain on speaking terms with yourself. The person who does not think, who never conducts this inner dialogue, does not experience this constraint. He is not wicked in a deliberate sense. He simply has no internal partner to object when he goes along with whatever his environment demands. He will sign the deportation order because everyone around him is signing it, and there is no voice inside him to raise a question. This is the connection Arendt drew between thoughtlessness and evil. The person who never thinks is not the person most likely to perform spectacular acts of villainy. He is the person most available for any villainy that happens to present itself as normal. Part 22. The Will and its Contradictions. The second volume of The Life of the Mind turns from thinking to willing, and immediately encounters a problem the first volume did not face. Thinking has a continuous history in Western philosophy going back to the pre-Socratics. Willing does not. The Greeks had no concept of the will as a distinct mental faculty. This absence is philosophically significant because the will is the faculty that makes genuine freedom possible. Thinking deals with what is and what has been. It contemplates, it examines, it dissolves, but it does not initiate action in the world. For that, something else is needed, a faculty oriented toward the future, capable of projecting into what does not yet exist and resolving to bring it about. That faculty is the will. Arendt traced its discovery to early Christianity, specifically to the writings of St. Paul and St. Augustine. Paul experienced the will as something torn against itself. He wanted to do the good, but found another force within him that resisted. This inner conflict between willing and not willing, between the command of the will and the resistance of some counter-will, became the defining experience of willing in the Western tradition. Augustine went further and located in the will the capacity for absolute beginning. Because humans have will, they can start something genuinely new, something not determined by prior causes. Augustine grounded this capacity in the fact of birth. Each person being born is herself a beginning, and therefore capable of beginning. Arendt recognized in Augustine the earliest formulation of what she would later call Natality, the ontological basis for freedom and action. But the philosophical tradition after Augustine mostly tried to abolish the will or reduce it to something else. Hobbes identified willing with the last appetite before action, dissolving it into desire. Spinoza denied free will entirely, claiming that those who believe in it are merely ignorant of the causes that determine them. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche each constructed philosophies in which the will becomes a cosmic force rather than a personal faculty of choice. Heidegger argued that the will is itself a form of domination, that willing is the metaphysical expression of the drive to master everything, including the future. Arendt took seriously the will's internal contradiction, the fact that every act of willing generates its own counter-will. When you resolve to do something, you simultaneously become aware of your ability not to do it, and this awareness is not mere background noise, but an active resistance within the self. The will is the only mental faculty that is at war with itself by its very nature. Thinking can reach temporary peace in understanding. Willing never rests because its object, the future, does not yet exist and can always be otherwise. She resolved this impasse, or rather pointed toward a resolution, by returning once more to natality. The will's freedom is not the philosophical will to power that Heidegger critiqued. It is the capacity built into every human being by virtue of being born, the capacity to begin something that the chain of prior causes did not determine. The will finds its proper exercise not in dominating the world, but in initiating action within it. At the end of the volume, Arendt was pointing toward her theory of judgment as the faculty that could reconcile thinking and willing, but she died before she could write it. Part 23. Conscience and the Refusal to Participate. In several essays written during the 1960s and 70s, Arendt asked a deceptively simple question about the Nazi era. When moral collapse became nearly universal, when an entire society reorganized itself around murder, what characterized the few people who refused to go along? The conventional answers did not hold up under examination. It was not that the resistors had better moral education. Highly educated people, including philosophers and theologians, participated in the regime without difficulty. It was not that they held firmer religious convictions. Churches collaborated. It was not that they were political radicals with alternative ideologies. Many of the non-participants were politically quiet people with no ideological framework at all. What the non-participants shared, Arendt argued, was a specific kind of self-relationship. They were people who could not commit certain acts and continue to live with themselves afterward. When they explained their refusal, they did not appeal to universal moral principles or divine commandments. They said things like, "I could not do this and remain myself." The decisive factor was not what they believed about the world, but how they related to themselves as thinking, self-aware beings. This connects directly to the two-in-one. The non-participants were people who had an active inner dialogue and who knew they would have to face themselves in solitude after the deed was done. Their moral compass was not a set of external rules, but the internal necessity of maintaining coherence with themselves as partners in self-reflection. They asked not what is the right thing to do according to some moral system, but what can I do without becoming someone I cannot bear to be. Arendt drew from this observation a striking and uncomfortable conclusion. Morality, at its most basic level, is not a relationship between the self and others, but a relationship between the self and itself. If you have no relationship with yourself, if you never think and therefore never experience the inner duality of consciousness, you have no conscience in any meaningful sense. You are available for anything because there is no internal court of judgment to object. She connected this to Kant's formulation of moral autonomy, but with a crucial modification. For Kant, the moral person legislates universal laws through reason. For Arendt, the moral person is first of all someone who is aware of being a legislator, aware that she is not a cog in a machine, but a responsible agent whose decisions carry weight. The consciousness of selfhood precedes the capacity for moral reasoning. You must first know that you exist as a self with whom you must live before any moral principle can get a grip on you. This analysis has a sobering implication for moral education. You cannot make people moral by teaching them rules, because rules are useless to someone who has never developed the habit of self-examination. The only real foundation for moral behavior is the active practice of thinking, the ongoing internal conversation that produces conscience as a byproduct. In times of moral catastrophe, when all external standards collapse and all social norms point toward evil, this inner resource is the only one that survives. Part 24. Judgment. The Actor and the Spectator. Judgment was to be the crowning concept of Arendt's philosophy, the third volume of The Life of the Mind that she never completed. She died in 1975 with the typewriter before her, having written just the title page for the section on judging. What she left behind are scattered essays, a set of lectures on Kant's political philosophy, and enough fragments to reconstruct two distinct models of judgment that exist in tension with each other. The first model appears in her earlier writings and treats judgment as the faculty of the political actor. A citizen in the public realm must constantly decide what to do, whose argument to support, which course of action to pursue. These decisions cannot be made by applying universal rules to particular cases, because political situations are always unique and unrepeatable. Judgment, in this first model, is the ability to assess a particular situation without subsuming it under a general law. Arendt found the philosophical basis for this capacity in Kant, but not in the place where most readers look. She drew not from Kant's moral philosophy with its categorical imperative, but from his third critique, the critique of judgment, originally about aesthetic taste. When you judge a painting to be beautiful, you are not applying a rule that defines beauty. You are making a judgment about a particular object that claims validity for others without being able to prove it through logical demonstration. You say this is beautiful and expect others to agree, but your expectation rests not on proof, but on an appeal to a shared sensibility that Kant called the sensus communis, the common sense. Arendt argued that political judgment works the same way. When a citizen judges that a policy is just or a leader is trustworthy, she is not deducing from axioms. She is exercising a faculty that depends on what Arendt called an enlarged mentality, the capacity to represent the perspectives of others in one's own mind. The more standpoints you can hold in mind simultaneously, the more valid your judgment becomes. But this validity is never the compulsive certainty of a logical proof. It is the kind of validity that can only be won through persuasion and the mutual testing of opinions. The second model appears in her later writings and shifts the emphasis from the actor to the spectator. Here, the paradigm of judgment is not the citizen deciding how to act, but the historian or storyteller looking back at events and assessing their meaning. The spectator has a privilege the actor lacks: distance. The actor, caught up in the web of action, cannot see the full significance of what she is doing. The spectator, withdrawn from direct participation, can represent the event from multiple perspectives and grasp its meaning retrospectively. These two models point in different directions, and scholars have spent decades debating which one represents Arendt's final position. The actor model emphasizes participation, engagement, and the formation of political opinion through public debate. The spectator model emphasizes impartiality, contemplation, and the recovery of meaning from the past. Ronald Beiner, who edited Arendt's Kant lectures, argued that she moved decisively toward the spectator model in her late work. Others, like Salah Ben Habib, have tried to reconcile the two by showing that even the spectator must engage in representative thinking, which is itself a form of political activity. The incompleteness is significant, not just biographically but philosophically. Judgment sits at the intersection of thinking and acting, the mental life and the political life, the contemplative withdrawal from the world and the engaged participation in it. That Arendt could not finish this work suggests that the problem may be genuinely unresolvable, that the relationship between understanding the world and acting in it may resist any final theoretical integration. The gap between spectator and actor may be one that each person must bridge for herself through the exercise of the very faculty Arendt was trying to describe. Part 25. Truth, Lies, and the Fate of Facts. In 1967, Arendt published an essay called Truth and Politics, and in 1971 another called Lying in Politics, written in response to the Pentagon Papers. Together they form her most sustained analysis of the relationship between factual truth and political life. She began with a paradox. Truth and politics seem to be natural enemies because truth compels assent, while politics depends on the free exchange of opinions. If something is true, there is nothing to debate about it. 2 + 2 = 4 is not a matter of perspective, and insisting on debate about it is not democratic but absurd. Truth is coercive in the specific sense that it leaves no room for the plurality of views that is the lifeblood of political life. From this observation, a dangerous conclusion tempts. If truth is anti-political, then perhaps politics can dispense with truth entirely. Arendt rejected this conclusion absolutely, but she reached the rejection through a distinction rather than a simple denial. There are two kinds of truth: rational truth, the truths of logic and mathematics, and factual truth, the truths about what actually happened. Rational truth has no essential connection to politics. Factual truth is inseparable from it. Factual truth, that a specific event happened, that a leader said a specific thing, that a policy produced a specific outcome, is the ground on which political opinions are formed. Opinions can differ legitimately about what to do, but they cannot differ legitimately about what happened. If the facts themselves are in dispute, then opinion formation becomes impossible because there is nothing left for opinions to be about. Freedom of opinion, Arendt wrote, is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed. This is why organized lying is so politically destructive. A single lie can be corrected. But when a government systematically produces alternative narratives about what happened, when it employs entire institutions to manufacture a fictional version of events, something worse occurs than mere deception. The capacity of citizens to orient themselves in the common world is destroyed. They lose not just specific truths, but the very sense that a factual reality exists to which opinions can be held accountable. The Pentagon Papers revealed exactly this pattern at the highest levels of American government. Officials had systematically deceived Congress, the public, and eventually themselves about the war in Vietnam. What struck Arendt most was not the lying itself, which she expected from governments, but the self-deception. The deceivers had constructed an image of reality so elaborate and so internally consistent that they began to believe it themselves. They lost contact with what was actually happening on the ground, because their own fabricated version was more coherent than messy reality. Arendt identified a specific mechanism she called defactualization. When a government engages in systematic lying, it does not merely cover up facts, but actively replaces them with a fictional narrative that is more plausible, more coherent, and more satisfying than the truth. Reality, she noted, has the disconcerting habit of being unexpected and inconsistent. A well-crafted lie is always smoother than the truth because the liar is not constrained by what actually happened. This is why factual truth is so vulnerable to political manipulation. The truth is often messy, complicated, and unsatisfying, while the lie can be tailored to fit what the audience expects and desires. The practical conclusion is stark. A free press and the institutional protection of factual truth are not accessories to political life, but its preconditions. Without reliable access to accurate information, the entire structure of opinion formation, debate, and collective judgment collapses. Citizens who cannot distinguish between what happened and what their government claims happened are citizens in name only. They inhabit a world of fiction and have no common reality to share. Part 26. Amor Mundi. Arendt originally intended to title The Human Condition with a different phrase, Amor Mundi, love of the world. She was talked out of it but the phrase names the emotional and philosophical foundation of her entire project. Every thinker has a disposition toward existence that precedes and shapes their arguments. For some, it is anxiety, for others, curiosity, for others, resentment or hope. For Arendt, it was a specific form of love, directed not at humanity in the abstract, but at the world, the shared space of appearances, institutions, and stories that human beings build between themselves. She loved the world in the way you might love a city, not because it is perfect, but because it is the only home available to beings who are mortal and plural. This love of the world is not optimism. Arendt had no illusions about what human beings are capable of at their worst. She spent years studying the most systematic destruction of the common world ever attempted, but her response to that destruction was not despair or withdrawal from political life. It was the insistence that the world, precisely because it is fragile and human-made, deserves our active care and attention. Amor Mundi stands in deliberate contrast to two other orientations that dominate Western thought. The first is the love of God that pulls the soul away from earthly concerns toward eternal truth. The second is the love of humanity in the abstract, which Arendt distrusted because it tends to sacrifice particular persons and particular places in the name of a universal ideal. She preferred the love of specific things, this city, this institution, this practice of citizenship, this conversation between these particular people. The distinction matters because it shapes how you respond when the world goes wrong. If you love humanity, you may conclude that the world must be remade from scratch to fit an ideal of human perfection. If you love God, you may conclude that the world is fallen beyond repair, and that salvation lies elsewhere. If you love the world, you try to repair it, to preserve what is valuable, to create new spaces of appearance where the old ones have been destroyed, and to accept that perfection is not available to beings who are born and die. This disposition also explains Arendt's distinctive relationship to forgiveness and to the past. Because she loved the world, she was committed to reconciling herself with its history, even its most horrific chapters. Reconciliation is not approval. It is the willingness to face what happened without turning away and without pretending it could have been otherwise. The storyteller who narrates the past, even the terrible past, is performing an act of Amor Mundi, because she is preserving the world's reality against the temptation of forgetfulness and fantasy. Arendt's philosophy ends not with a system, but with an orientation. Think for yourself. Appear among others. Act in concert with them on matters you share. Keep the space of appearance alive through your willingness to speak and to listen. Accept the unpredictability and irreversibility of what you do, and rely on promising and forgiving to make continued action possible. Tell the stories that preserve the meaning of what has happened, even when the meaning is painful, and love the world enough to remain in it, to care for it, to fight for its preservation as a common home for beings who will never agree about everything and who must not be forced to. That is the core of the matter. The world is not guaranteed. It is maintained only by the activity of those who share it, and it perishes the moment they stop caring for it. Arendt's entire body of work is an extended argument for why that care is the most important thing a human being can exercise.